On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Good afternoon. I'm glad you came here because I'd like to take the opportunity to puncture the lies and tell the truth. The truth is that Hamas still has thousands of armed terrorists in Gaza.
That's what it sounded like on Sunday as Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu summoned foreign journalists to his office in Jerusalem to explain why he intends to send the IDF in to capture the rest of Gaza, 22 months into Israel's retaliatory war against Hamas after the terrorist group's October 7th attack. But before any troops get the go-ahead, which is supposed to happen 2 months from now on October 7th, they'll wait until about 1 million Palestinians sheltering in Gaza City leave and move to camps in the south where Israel will provide food and medical care. Netanyahu's universal plan has sparked international criticism, including from Canada. Leaders worry about the growing humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip and blame Israel for keeping urgent food aid out, which Israel denies. But the plan has also put the spotlight once more on the deep divisions in Israeli society between extreme right-wing politicians and religious settlers who want Israel to annex Gaza and rebuild Jewish communities there, and on the other side, the families of the hostages and of fallen IDF soldiers and some senior military officials who fear launching combat in the densely populated area of Gaza City will be the death knell for the remaining hostages who are believed to be still held there. There are calls now coming to join a general strike this coming weekend in Israel in protest of Netanyahu's plan and in support of freeing the hostages first and foremost. Netanyahu's plan was announced exactly 20 years to the month, August 2005, when Israeli society faced another wrenching conflict over the best way to bring about peace and security. The second intifada had been going on for 5 years, leaving 1,000 Israelis dead from suicide bombings and terrorist attacks. Triple that number of Palestinians died when Israel retaliated. At the time, Israel's Prime Minister was Ariel Sharon and Netanyahu was the finance minister. Israel had been occupying Gaza for nearly 40 years by that point, after capturing the area from Egypt in the 1967 war. But the cost in Jewish lives and IDF personnel to police over 1 million Palestinians and also a cost to the morale of Israel was becoming too high. So Sharon decided it would be better to withdraw, seal it off, and sort of cut off the injured arm and save the body. 8,000 Jewish settlers in 21 settlements were forced to leave their homes beginning August 15th, 2005. And you might recall scenes of violent protests when hundreds of Israelis refused to go. Hamas then declared victory in Gaza. Ariel Sharon did not hold a national referendum before pushing ahead with the disengagement from Gaza. He likely would have lost anyway. But the scars from those fraught days might have been smaller today had Israelis on all sides of the issue just sat down and talked with each other first.
So if I take an action that, I think is the best for you, but don't negotiate it with you, and that would be the withdrawal, for example, in essence, I'm telling you I don't care about you or that I'm unwilling to engage with you. And I think at best you have to see that unilateral withdrawal in that light. So that definitely set the stage for a lack of engagement in substantive negotiations over, a two-state solution or the future with any Palestinian partner.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Wednesday, August 13th, 2025. Welcome to North Star, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Seeing talk of all this Gaza reoccupation unfold today brings back sharp memories for a Canadian negotiation expert, John Schulman, who 20 years ago spent days holed up in a conference room in Jerusalem with a small team from Harvard University Law School, trying to get opposing Israeli groups to build bridges with one another over the coming disengagement from Gaza. It was 2005. But Schulman's three-step dialogue technique didn't fully work. Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quit the Sharon government, warning that leaving Gaza would spark an upsurge in terrorism, and the real peace with the Palestinians was not achieved. As Hamas built tunnels and arsenals in Gaza and then struck Israel on October 7th, 2023, while the Jewish state was distracted by massive pro-democracy protests. John Schulman's now based in Guysborough, Nova Scotia, from where he runs his Aligner negotiation consultancy, a firm he founded with his wife, who he met at Harvard Law School when they were both classmates of Barack Obama and his wife, Michelle. Schulman holds out little hope that dialogue can be achieved in Israel right now, but joins me to explain why mending the divide should be tackled first before any peace talks with the Palestinians can hope to succeed.
Oh, thank you so much, Ellen. It's really a privilege to be with you. Right? Very excited about our conversation.
Well, look, you must be having deja vu because 20 years ago this week, the Israeli government under Ariel Sharon started the disengagement from Gaza. And you had a front row seat to part of that historic time. So let's get your sort of lightning reaction to the news that came out of Israel that the Security Cabinet has authorized an occupation, again, militarily.
You said it. It's deja vu, right? It just took me immediately back to conversations that were very, very intense and personal for the participants. And, it made me feel very sad that 20 years ago, people were talking about how to handle very difficult situations and how important it was to talk among, themselves. And even though they had very, very different viewpoints, and now it feels as if the world we're in, there's not as much conversation and a lot more conflict and violence. It's really hard.
Let's take our listeners and yourself back. How did it happen that John Schulman gets called by the Israeli side 20 years ago to try to help the negotiations about this withdrawal of Israeli settlements and settlers?
It was very strange. Well, actually, the program negotiation at Harvard is at the time was run by a guy named Bob Mnookin, really a superb human being, a wonderful negotiator, a great expert in negotiation and conflict resolution. And I had gone to Harvard Law School years ago. And Bob basically reached out to me because I had previously consulted with him, talked with him about negotiation process. And he gave me a call. He said, I think we have an ideal situation where we really need some process discipline. And it turned out that he and an Israeli lawyer had been retained by a group in Israel to essentially facilitate a dialogue. That's really what it was about, to help some very eminent and, thoughtful people who were really trying to figure out if there was a path forward that would minimize conflict and violence within Israel over what to do about Gaza.
Because it was very fraught. There was about 8,000 settlers, 21 settlements, plus 4 in the West Bank.
It was so unbelievably complex just on the Israeli side. So there were other dialogues, other projects going on the Palestinian side. The piece that I was brought in was just on the Israeli side. And we were bringing together a group of, it was, about 15 to 20 people total who were involved to really have a structured dialogue, to see if there was a way to get some kind of consensus moving forward about what to do. And to your point, there was incredible anger, hostility, distrust internally within Israel among these groups.
Today, I can't even imagine that this happens.
No, that's a great point. I believe he was brought in and we were brought in as a team because the people involved were very, very senior people who felt that they could benefit from some structure and expertise to have a dialogue that they themselves recognized was really urgent.
All right, bring us back a little bit. Could you describe like where this was held? Who was in the room? Did they cater it? How many days were you involved?
So we did it over a 2-year period, actually, before and then after the withdrawal. Going in the first time in 2005, it was a 2-day organized agenda. We did it at a fancy hotel. Basically, I can't identify the individuals because it was confidential, but we had on the right, we had leaders who were from a religious specific perspective about Gaza, others on the right who had more of a political perspective on Gaza. There were military leaders, negotiators who had been negotiating with the Palestinian Authority, Peace Now activists, government-connected people, and we had an interesting right-leaning commentator. The dialogue was fascinating, but the tension when we started was pretty incredible. We also, I don't speak Hebrew. Bob wasn't conversant, and so we actually had headphones with real-time translation going, an interpreter, and it was incredibly intense.
What strategies does a negotiator employ? Your 3 steps and the various steps that everybody can maybe possibly get something out of it and feel positive coming out.
In general, process is really, really important. And what I mean by that is the ability for people to speak and be heard is critical. So the 3 steps that we typically use are, first of all, what are the interests of the stakeholders? So who's involved and what do they need? What are their underlying interests? What are they trying to achieve? And I learned some amazing things about that during the dialogue, things I don't think I could have learned anywhere else. It was just fascinating. So that's step one. The second step then, which is something that when we're in conflict seems really hard to do, but is crucial to move forward, is now that we understand who's involved and what do they need, what are some ideas, some options we could come together with potentially to find agreement? So are there areas where we might have interests in common that we could do something about together that would start building momentum toward some kind of collaboration or agreement? And then the third step is what we call, kind of provocatively, fighting alternatives, which really means what might people do unilaterally to satisfy their own interests if there is no agreement? And of course, as you know, ultimately in 2005, that was the path that was taken by the government. It was a unilateral withdrawal.
So the past 22 months, Qatar and Egypt and the States have been trying to broker peace talks, and for years. Are we at DEFCON 3 or step 3 where it has been now a unilateral decision? Is that what you're seeing, that there's no way that they could talk? Everyone has different interests, and so Israel's doing step 3?
What I believe, and what I did learn in part through the dialogue we facilitated 20 years ago, is the ability to actually have dialogue, to listen and understand each other's perspectives is absolutely crucial in forming any kind of durable solutions going forward. What I mean by that is, let's take it on a more simple level. If at home I decide that I'm just going to do something and I'm not consulting with other members of my family and I'm just going to do it regardless of what they think, even if I convince myself, oh, I'm doing it for their best interests, but I take a unilateral action and just do it, the likelihood that they feel that, our relationship benefited from it is very low. Even if it's not something that they hated, they probably didn't like the idea that I'm just doing it because I think I can. And so this idea of doing things unilaterally is very, very provocative and damaging to relationships, in part because one of the things we're communicating when we do things unilaterally, especially when there's conflict, is I believe I can do it and, in effect, get away with it, whatever it is. I find that way of thinking generally is, to me, it's a somewhat short-term way of thinking, in that, again, if I care about relationships, both internal or external, those relationships are almost always going to be damaged by my taking unilateral action. So I don't know where we are, at this moment. I'm not part of any of those discussions, But I do think it's important for people who care about these issues, care about the communities, care about the people involved, that we try to find ways to engage in conversation and dialogue. This is a real challenge these days, I think, for a lot of us who want to have that human connection, have that ability to build and rebuild relationships where they need to be built.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Do you think something like this, where Israel says we're going to free Gaza City from Hamas, make it safe, hand it over to somebody, a third party, to run, rebuild everything for you, so we're not occupying it, we're liberating it for you? Does this work in terms of negotiations in your strategies?
What politicians and leaders say publicly is often very different from what they're saying privately. What I hope is happening is people are engaged in dialogue who have an understanding of the interests of all the people affected, the different stakeholders, and can find a path forward. I suspect that is happening. I'm not part of it, but I would be shocked if it were not happening. At the same time, we know that there are leaders and there are, times when people do things very, very aggressively and unilaterally. And then, we're all dealing with the consequences, whatever they are. And I think that's the challenge, in this world that we're in right now, is how do you have the correct channels behind the scenes to actually influence and impact decision making? And then do you see the results? So you and I could have a dialogue. We could have conversation, but if somebody else outside of our conversation is going ahead and doing things that are essentially undermining everything we're talking about, at some point, you or I or both of us are going to say, what are we even talking about? What's the point? And that's, I think, the big challenge that we're seeing now is, again, whenever people take unilateral action, it is essentially communicating that we have the power to do it. And when you do that, the likelihood that you're then going to engage in a meaningful, healthy, and productive dialogue, in my experience, is reduced.
That might be fair when you're like trying to do a labor negotiation with a symphony orchestra where people are relatively safe. But in a war situation, where these are huge stakes, can you even negotiate properly the way businesses do and you teach and you try?
There's two questions. One, are they listening? And two, whose interests are they pursuing? These are the questions. And with leaders, the answers are generally opaque.
Well, it could be their own interests. It could be the coalition's interests. It could be Trump's interests. It could be Egypt's interests. There's a whole brokering behind the scenes. There's a lot we don't know.
But I think it's so challenging because the scale of the conflict and the level of suffering has become, a barrier. And I think there are internally within Israeli society, from my understanding, very, very deep disagreements about how to proceed. Those are the kinds of disagreements that we were actually trying to address 20 years ago. And of course, I think it's fair to say, obviously, unsuccessfully. So I think a lot of what we're seeing, as they say, across the table, to the extent there is a table, is also hindered by internal conflict within each side's societies. And that was sort of the theory that we were operating on back 20 years ago, and I think it's still relevant today.
You still have some notes, I was told.
I do.
From 20 years ago.
I do.
You have them with you? Is there anything you want to share with us, like a passage that struck you today our listeners might want to know?
One person said the debate they were having over withdrawal from Gaza 20 years ago was becoming a debate over identity, over a way of life. And, essentially disagreement was turning into betrayal. And it was becoming a biblical struggle, a cultural conflict and a biblical struggle about what it meant to be Jewish or Israeli, which they said, the person said, what can we do to find another way? Because when you overlap culture and politics in such a way, it's really dangerous. And I thought that was really interesting because I think that's played out. I think we've seen that within Israeli society is it has become, a really, 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 really deep rift about what it is to be Jewish, what it is to be Israeli. Very hard to reconcile positions at some point. One of the other things that was really hopeful and really struck me, and this was an interesting thing, there was a leader of settlements who was very old and could not come for the first day. And then he came, and he was a really, really polarizing figure, a very public figure who was really hardline, at least publicly. One of the things they were talking about at the time was whether there should be a popular referendum about what to do. And he had been publicly completely opposed to the possibility. But after listening to the dialogue, he said, I've taken a tactical decision to support a referendum, knowing we would lose some support from the hardcore settlers. He was willing to break with basically his followers. And he said, partnership within this group is an achievement in and of itself of the group that we had assembled and the dialogue we were having. And he said, we can repatch from the fabric. Even though we'll still see the tear marks, we can repatch. But the conflict between the left and the right is very dangerous. That's what he said. In Israel, what I realized is they had grown so accustomed to conflict, internal conflict as well as external, that had become the norm. And so the absence of conflict was what they perceived as uncertain and scary. And that's a tough way to live.
Interesting. But this is what it is now. That's their norm is bomb shelters. Their norm is Houthi missiles. Everybody's kids it's all normal. Dogs, they know how to go to shelters by themselves.
Yeah. So that really struck me. But to hear, people who participated, who came in with very hard views, be willing and express real deep emotional regret for what he had created in terms of internal conflict, it was powerful. It was really powerful.
You said that the process was 20 years ago. You did 2 days before and afterwards. You didn't tell us what you did after the withdrawal.
Well, we came back after the withdrawal, and it was like everything had been flipped. Those on the religious right and secular right, boy, it was a hard discussion they were so upset, obviously, at what had happened and felt betrayed. It's supposed to be 2 days, and it ended after one.
What year was that? Do you remember?
That would have been 2006.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was interesting because it goes back to your point about when there's conflict, open conflict, the willingness, the likelihood of being able to have the dialogue, it just really goes way down, way down.
Observers have said that the unilateral withdrawal was done partly to put a monkey wrench into any possible peace negotiations, into the Oslo Accords. It just stopped it dead. And I'm wondering if you agree with that assessment, and then if you do, how does that frame what we're seeing about to happen now?
So I have a slightly different take. I'm not saying that's wrong. But there's another aspect of it that I was privy to from the dialogue. And that is there was deep concern among Israeli leadership and civil society about the nature and costs of the internal conflict within Israeli society about the settlements in Gaza. It was really a serious issue. And so one of the people in my notes, somebody said, we fear civil war. If this continues, we actually fear civil war. So we forget today, because of what's happened, how divided and how much anger and conflict there was internally within Israel about what to do.
A book that your mentor wrote in 2010 called Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate and When to Fight. Can you negotiate with Hamas?
I think the key is you have to negotiate on behalf of your stakeholders, your constituents, and you have to negotiate with an understanding of the other side's constituents as well, their stakeholders. And when you look at it that way, it's a lot more complex, and there are more opportunities to find some kind of common ground on something to move forward than if you just say a hard no and we're always going to fight. Because as we've seen, a lot of people who are not able to, raise their voices and say what they want are impacted, in so many ways by the inability of leaders to come to some kind of agreement on some things. And I think ultimately what we see is that even in most intractable conflicts, at some point there is a negotiated resolution of some kind most of the time. The older I get in life, the more I've seen conflict is incredibly damaging and rarely yields good outcomes.
But in terms of Israelis sitting down with Palestinians,
No, I'm saying the first step is internal. I think there's very little positive path forward without this dialogue, because I think it's really super hard to move forward externally when there's internal divisions that are so deep.
can one do that in the middle of a conflict, though, in terms of a war, in terms of threats from 7 other nations, the United Nations? Everybody's against Israel now except for the United States.
I would flip it around. I would ask the question, can Israel afford not to do it? Because if it doesn't happen, where does this end? The path it's going, where's it going to end? I don't think anybody who really studies it thinks that this is a sustainable path going forward, what's going on now. I think without the internal dialogue, as hard as it is, and as hard as it is in this moment, it's really hard for me to be able to see where the future goes. It's very hard to see. I don't know.
To end off then, do you feel that the disengagement was a failure for Israel and a victory for Hamas?
I would say it this way. Because the process itself was not a negotiated process, but a unilateral process, I think that was critical in what ended up happening. And I think if you want durable, peaceful, or at least relatively healthy and positive relationships with people, you have to negotiate with them.
Listen, it's been an honor to go over this important historic time with you and to hear your views from 20 years ago. There's obviously a book. You need to write a book.
Yeah, I mean, I hope the future improves for everybody involved, because it's been tough.
Thanks for being on the CJN's North Star podcast with us.
Thank you, Ellen. It's really a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks, as always, to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Canada's Foreign Minister Anita Anand joined with 26 other countries to urge Israel to let aid agencies flood Gaza with food and supplies. Yesterday, Ottawa condemned the Israeli military's killing of an Al Jazeera journalist, although Israel insists the man led a cell of Hamas and has photographic evidence to prove it. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman and Andrea Varsany. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman, and the theme music for the show is by Brett Higgins. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.